Gentlemen, I'm going to keep the introduction short because the next topic is so important to our industry, as mentioned by Nick Varney when he spoke this morning. The focus being on national living wage and the impact on our sector. And to chair this session, I am delighted to introduce Alistair Storey, who is the chairman of WSH, also a director of the BHA serving on our board. Alistair, I invite you to the stage. Thank you. Thanks, Alistair.
Good morning still. I'd like, without further ado, to introduce Sir David Norgrove to do a short presentation. Sir David is the chairman of the Low Pay Commission, and Nick Varney very eloquently talked about the potential implications of the national living wage for this industry. So it will be helpful in this session to understand perhaps the backcloth to that first of all, and then I've got a panel of six very experienced people from various parts of the industry, and we'll have a discussion on the presentation and indeed the views from the panel, and I hope from members of the audience. So Sir David, if I could invite you on stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. As I sat there listening to Andrew's sentence, I was pleased. I realised I was pleased to be here for two main reasons. One is that the BHA and its membership are so important to us on the Low Pay Commission, both as people who talk to us about the effects of the minimum wage, and the BHA itself as a body that gives very valuable evidence to us as we think about what we should be recommending about the minimum wage, and from now on, of course, also the national living wage. And the second reason for my to be pleased to be here is that I've spent the last few days thinking and talking about nothing else except the outcome of the referendum. And looking at the title of your association, it reminded me that people still need to eat, drink, sleep, and travel. In turn, it reminded me further about the role of the Low Pay Commission in needing to keep its focus very much on the practicalities of the effects of the minimum wage on employment and on business generally. And that's really the focus of my short remarks as the introduction to this session. So first of all, firms face many changes, not just the effects of the referendum. And this slide was put together before the outcome of the referendum, and it outweighs, I'm sure, most of the things on here. But there are lots of other effects on business that we need to take into account. So what was the minimum wage for originally? Remarkably, during the debates on the minimum wage, nobody actually said what it was for. We were given no objective, and over the last couple of years, the last few years, we as a commission have worked out what we think we are for. And you'll be surprised about that. And the government successive governments have accepted this as our objective for the minimum wage, which is to help as many low-paid people as possible without costing them their jobs. And the level of the minimum wage itself is based on the affordability to business, not the needs of employees. And it's generally thought to have succeeded. You don't need to look at every last detail of this chart, but it's the income distribution at the beginning of the minimum wage and in the latest figures. And what you can see is down at the left-hand end of the chart, the bottom has been cut off. So the pay of the lowest paid people has been pushed up much more than it would have been otherwise. So it's ended extreme low pay, and that's been achieved without, as far as we can tell, much if any effect on employment. And it's won wide support to the extent that we have people from all over the world come to see the Low Pay Commission and talk to us about how the UK has achieved this. And business broadly has adjusted well. you've told us on our visits around the country about particular issues, and certainly there have had to be changes. There have had to be changes in benefits, and we're seeing that now with the adjustment to the national living wage. Differentials have been squeezed. There have been increased prices, some reduction in profit. And there's maybe been some reduction in jobs and some impact on hours, but pretty, as far as we can tell, pretty minimal. Non-compliance on the whole has been, as far as we can tell, quite low, although with something like this, it's extremely difficult to tell. So the national living wage was introduced, to our surprise and without talking to us, without consulting us, in July last year. And the target for that is rather different. The Chancellor, George Osborne, set a target which he described as an ambition of 60% of median earnings in 2020, compared to about 54–55% as of July last year, with an objective of £9. Of course, what's not been specified, or at least been rather elided in public, is what happens if 60% of median earnings is not the same as £9. And I'll show you in a moment that successive pay forecasts have been falling to the extent that even as of a few months ago, we were barely at £9 in 2020 with 60%. So if we don't achieve the kind of growth in pay and output that the Chancellor was projecting last July over the next few years, which of those is going to take priority? And I think that is clearly one thing the BHA will need to take a very close interest in. The big change, of course, last July was that the Chancellor, in announcing the national living wage, accepted some job losses. So the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, was forecasting somewhere between 10,000 and 120,000 job losses by 2020. That's, as I say, a completely different way of looking at the minimum wage from the one that was followed from 1997 until 2015, where the objective was as high as possible without costing people their jobs. So we are now enjoined to look at this with accepting some job losses. And we're interpreting our job as to look at the path of the national living wage and look to check whether it's sustainable within the context of that level of job losses. And around that, of course, there is this test which the Chancellor also described, that it's subject to sustained economic growth. And I'll come back to that again in a second too. It is a huge change. So a huge gain to those people who remain in work, and we expect most people, of course, not to be affected in terms of their employment, rising to over £3,000 by 2020. And the coverage means that by 2020, around 1 in 6 private sector jobs is going to be covered by some form of minimum wage. It's an enormous change in the pace of the increase of the minimum wage. So the relative increase for the 25 pluses over the next 4 years is as much as all the previous years put together. So let me show that in terms of coverage. Up till this last year, there's the path of the increase in the numbers of people earning the minimum wage. You can see it fell fairly sharply early on. In fact, it was rather stable up to about 2007, 2008. There was a little bit of an increase then. After the recession we kept it fairly stable, and since then it's been rising quite sharply. This is what we now expect to happen. It's a startling increase in the number of people who will be on some form of the minimum wage, reaching, as I say, around 1 in 6 of all those people employed in the private sector. The coverage around the country will vary quite considerably. From London, you can see it as the second bar from the top there, through to Wales and the East Midlands at the bottom. But nevertheless, even in London, we shouldn't underestimate the effects. There are more people on the minimum wage in London than there are in any other region of the country. Not everywhere is like Kensington and Chelsea, Waltham Forest, for example, is an area of very high unemployment and pressure on pay. And we need to take that into account. London is not one single labour market. So very wide variation around the country. And in terms of sectors. And I've picked out here the two sectors that you're most concerned with. So in 2015, around a quarter of employees within hospitality are or were on the minimum wage. We expect that to rise to around 40% in 2020. And in leisure, the proportion is expected to more than double from around 10% to 22%. But you can see just how important hospitality is in low pay. So the key challenge for you, much more than for us, but it is our job to recommend it, is the path to 60% or potentially £9. And we've seen in the press, and you've told us, about the squeezing of differentials, the squeezing of total pay. And then long term, we can expect to see changes in behaviour through investment, and not necessarily through investment, but through changes that deliver lower costs to offset rising costs of the national living wage. There are uncertainties, clearly. We're going to have to look separately each year at pay for the 21 and 24s, and we don't know how business is going to respond in terms of using the age rates. We can expect an increasing number of apprenticeships anyway, but also potentially as a way of reducing the costs. And then maybe the government will bring in further offsetting policies to reduce the cost of business. All those things we'll need to look at. So what's the role of the Low Pay Commission? So first of all, it's to recommend the path of the national living wage towards this target of 60%, to calculate the rate and to monitor its impact. But we do have this kind of red button, this emergency brake, which is based on the fact that it's subject to sustained economic growth. And I do want to assure you that we try to be absolutely as objective as we can, and we are not political. We will, I assure you, press that button if we think it's right to do so. Well, the button is not directly connected to the brake. Ministers will have to decide whether they accept our recommendation, and you can come to your own conclusions about how likely they are to do that, particularly in the run-up to an election. But we, as the Low Pay Commission, will certainly, as we have done throughout our life, act in an evidence-driven and as objective a way as we possibly can. For the other rates, we carry on as we do now, recommending the individual rates in a way which is aimed at increasing them as high as we possibly can without affecting employment. I'd have to say that with a national living wage there as a kind of shelter for these rates for younger people and for apprentices, they're likely to go up faster than they would otherwise have done. And I do believe that's something you have to factor into your own plans for the next few years. Here's the path as it stood in March, April. I don't know whether you can see that. Probably can, yes, good. As I said, it started out that 60% of median earnings in 2020 at the time the Chancellor made his announcement was £9.35. As of the last set of OPR forecasts, it was £9 and twopence. And I would bet my bottom dollar that come the autumn, we will be below £9 in terms of 60% of median earnings. Our plot, subject to sustained economic growth, is that the path between here and there should be a straight line. We're not going to play, unless there are unusual changes, play with that path. We think it's better to try to give certainty to business and to adopt a straight line. Who knows, though, over the next few months, whether the outlook for the economy will cause us to change our view. So how can you help? It's our job to look at the evidence, and I would hope very much that you will play your part, as you have done over past years, in helping us to come to an authoritative view. We need evidence from you of the effect of the path that we've so far proposed on the national living wage and on the minimum wage rates. We want you to tell us how you're being affected by those and how you're being affected by the economy. And we'll come and talk to you about it, and we'll hear it from your representatives. So what I'd very much like and ask you to do is to respond to the KPMG survey, which is currently out, to report back to us and to government on the effects of the national living wage. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to ask my fellow panelists just to introduce themselves briefly and give some of their initial thoughts on the implications of the national living wage. And I'm going to start with Simon Trusser, economist from KPMG.
Thank you.
Hand over to you, Simon.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Excellent, thank you. I'll start, if I may, with some things that we do know. There have been various studies out there that the overall impact of the minimum wage or the national living wage could be relatively small for the country as a whole. The Resolution Foundation, for example, recently published a report saying that only a small proportion of firms are likely to be affected by the NLW. Now, although that may be the case, it's absolutely not the case for every single industry. And it's absolutely not the case for the hospitality industry. And I think that's an important starting point. The Office of National Statistics estimated in April 2016, at the time that the NLW was introduced, 33.2% of people in the hospitality sector earned below the national living wage. And that led the ONS to conclude that the NLW is likely to have the biggest impact on businesses in the accommodation and food service industry. The Low Pay Commission similarly found that the hospitality sector was probably the second most affected industry behind cleaning of all sectors. So although overall, for the country as a whole, it may be that only a small proportion of firms are affected, it's quite clear that that's not the case for the hospitality sector, where a third of all employees are, at the introduction of the NLW, at a level below that amount. So the next question is, well, it clearly implies a very large increase in the cost base of the hospitality sector. As Nick Varney mentioned earlier on, 30 to 60% of the costs of businesses in this sector are related to employment. The question then is, well, since there's such a large increase in the cost base of this particular sector, what is it likely to do to the output of the sector, investment in the sector, employment, and so on? Now, the truth is, it's early days. It's very early to make a judgment on that, which is why the BHA, combined with the ALMR, has commissioned my team of economists at KPMG to conduct an economic analysis of the likely effects of the NLW on the sector. To do that, we're relying upon official statistics, but combining those with insights from the industry. And as you mentioned, we've recently put out a survey to all BHA and ALMR members to gather insights that will feed into that assessment. So, as has been said before, I'd urge everybody that has received it to open it, fill it in and send it back, because it will give us the richest possible evidence that is available on the possible impact of this sector. So we'd be very grateful if you could help us out with that.
Thanks, Simon. The next panellist is Andrew Selly, who's Chief Executive of Bidvest and supply into the sector. I'd be interested in your observations from that perspective, Andrew.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Good. Yes, in Bidvest Food Service we supply all parts of the sector, from global chains to small chains, from independent restaurants to to national restaurants, and we cover both public sector and private sector. So we're heavily invested in the hospitality industry, and there's probably just three key points I would make. Firstly, I think the actual cost of the living wage is significantly higher than the numbers that are touted around. If you look at our personal experience, we employ about 6,000 people. Actually, not many of them were impacted by the national living wage. It probably only cost us, it was still several £100,000, but not in proportion to our wage bill, not huge. But we've got a number of differentials within the pay structure that have always been there and still should be there. So we pay people more for working night shifts than day shifts. We pay people more for working in a cold store than an ambient warehouse. And once those differentials are eroded, then they have to be reinstated. And by the time you've reinstated those differentials, and by the time you've said things like, I personally don't think it's right for us to pay a 24-year-old doing the same job as a 25-year-old a different salary. So once you've taken those things into account, the actual impact on our wage bill was 3 or 4 times the initial impact of the pure living wage calculation. So I think we need to look at that in the broader perspective. Secondly, I think we need to be better connected, as the theme of the conference is, as an industry. So I fully concur that everyone should be filling in the KPMG survey, but there are other relevant industry bodies that I think could work with us. So I, for example, sit on the FWD, Federation of Wholesale Distributors, who service both the catering trade but also the independent retail trade, which is another industry heavily impacted by the living wage. FWD are doing their own research, and I think once we've got the results of the KPMG survey, we should be joining forces also with somebody like the Association of Convenience Stores and saying, how can we gain greater strength by working together as a broader industry that's affected. And the final point I would make is I just have a concern. I have no evidence for it, but I think we should be careful of the impact on the public sector from this, because I think in very simple terms, the two ways of minimising the impact of the living wage are put your costs up, put your prices up and put your costs down. If you're serving free school meals, or if you're serving food in a hospital, or even if you're serving food to prisoners through the Ministry of Justice, you don't have the option of putting your prices up. So therefore, you've got to get your costs down. You can't take it all out of labour. So my question is a broader impact of this that we'll see a lower quality of food being served to children and vulnerable adults in the public sector. And I think we need to look at that and consider that in our responses and our representations in the future.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Actually, I'd like, because Andrew represents a large business, to ask Andrew Evans, who's representing SMEs, I think, and has transformed his locality. So perhaps it would be interesting to hear your comments, Andrew, and how you perceive the NLW affecting your business.
Okay. Well, 80% of our industry are SMEs, employing small numbers of people. I consider myself a small company. We only employ 90 people, but it's significant. And a quick calculation of the national living wage with a 7% compounded increase, it goes to 90,000 a year, increase my wage bill. In 2020, £420,000. It'll cost me extra. Fine, I'm not against increasing payment to staff. We're an industry of meritocracy. We have a lot of entry-level staff who have a great opportunity to get their own business and be successful. Also, as a small business, we have taken considerable risk. I mentioned the seaside towns now. We're in a seaside community. And when I bought the hotel, we were a seaside hotel. We happen to be a hotel that happens to be at a seaside now with a totally different perspective. And in effect, we've been transformational. We've brought the community forward with us. There's now major public and private investment going into the community, and it's now a year-round destination, whereas it was 26 weeks, it's now 52 weeks. And our wage bill on a winter week, in one of my operations, my wage bill was 120% of my revenue, like Manchester City. So that's not sustainable. I think the covenants that I've got with the bank, I've taken a great risk. I'm obligated to meet covenants of margin, cash flow, cash retention, If I don't maintain that, my bank has got an open door to change my borrowing rates. So it is significant for me. Mentioned now about differentials. I've got dissatisfaction in my team. We said, be pleased. Some of your colleagues now have had a hefty pay rise. But it's not 50 pence an hour, it's £1,000 a year. That's that entry level. And then it increases then as the jobs go up. So how can we mitigate it? A couple of things. National insurance, if we can get relief. Hotel building allowance, I've invested heavily. Even a small business, I've put £3 million into my community over the last 2 years. And I'm a small business with my risk. Another one we can look at is revenue. I think a lot of us are quiet people. We're a fragmented industry. But the weight of the OTAs, the market cap of the OTAs, huge, successful, wealthy companies, probably wealthier than some of the large hotel organizations. But I think it'd be wonderful if we could look at the commission rates, where we're talking 15, 20, 18, 25, 35, even 40% commission rates. Now, I might be controversial here, but it's parasitic. We don't depend on them as much as they want us to depend on them. We want to book directly. So the top line, if we can convert our revenue to retention, and if we can look at all the other margins. Now, Andrew mentioned his costs there. Another factor we forget as well, that a compounded 7% increase on our payroll, but my suppliers have put their increase onto us, 10, 15, 20% increase on produce based on the living wage. So we are there collecting all this effect, and the review over the next months, over the next years, I'd like to see what the difference is going to be.
Thanks very much. Ranjit, you run some very fine restaurants in London. Ranjit Matrani was chairman and co-owner of MW Eat. How do you perceive the NLW and other things like the apprentice levy affecting your business going forward, and what are your views on how it was introduced?
I think I was a former senior civil servant, and I would say that this is, with respect to the Resolution Foundation and the Treasury, one of the worst introduced measures I've come across in a very long time. The absence of consultation, the absence of discussion, and the unintended consequences of this are really pretty bizarre. It is, I also speak as an economist, to have an economic distorting measure which weighs down very heavily on the employment generating sectors of industry is truly bizarre as an approach to creating employment. And the unintended consequences of government tinkering around with businesses will now manifest itself. So we have, in our case, the manifestations of this are that we have had to raise rates of pay across the whole band of our hourly paid workforce because of differentials. We might have squeezed them a bit, but they're still there. And therefore, we are now we've had to raise prices, but there's a limit to which we can mitigate our prices, so therefore we will be squeezing our profits unless we believe customers in a highly competitive marketplace will pay the going rate given other constraints. So we see this thing as being really a pretty deadly measure. And our only hope on this side is that either since the Chancellor is unlikely to last for more than 3 to 6 months, is that a future Chancellor might actually see more sense. In the absence of that, I think we would hope to see there being some mitigating measures affecting the employment-intensive areas of industry, which inevitably you can think about that, which is national insurance, what can be done on that side as well. VAT, by definition, will help the industry as a whole, but I think we as an industry have to be doing all we can, and this is where the KPMG, the study was being done, will be of great value because that will demonstrate objectively or analyze objectively the full impacts, and hopefully that can be used as an intellectual battering ram in the process of actually getting some sense into government.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Conor Darcy from the Resolution Foundation?
I will. So I can only agree with a lot of the comments that have already been made. This is a really big deal for hospitality and for the other sectors that we've already mentioned, like retail and cleaning. I think, though, I'm gonna maybe not have the most popular opinion, but I think it is important to pick out some of the positives in this. That you obviously, as it's repeatedly said, your staff are one of the most valuable assets that you have within the company. So this is going to be a good thing for the vast majority of your staff, who will have a bit more money coming into their pockets every week. But I think it's also a really good chance to look again at how you kind of make the most out of your staff. So the work that we've been doing on this, some of the work that Simon mentioned, we looked at the kind of the headline figures of what this means for different companies, and that tells you that wage bills might rise by 3%, but as we've already heard, there's probably a lot more behind that as well. But what we've also been asking employers is, what do they plan to do? So a survey that we did back at the end of last year, so after it had been announced, but before it had actually been introduced, was saying, what do you plan to do? How do you plan to mitigate this? And the number one response that we were getting from people was that they were using this as an opportunity to look at how to improve efficiency and how to raise productivity within their companies. Now, the obvious question that survey raises, well, what does that actually mean? We did some kind of follow-up case studies with that, and we kind of focused on hotels in that. And there was a real mix of ideas. Some were focusing on training and using fewer zero-hours staff because they felt they were less well-trained, less productive, and focusing on their kind of more highly trained staff. Others were looking again at their rota systems and how they kind of improve the customer experience. And the example in David's presentation there with the automated check-in, I think definitely investing in more technology is another potential one. There's some interesting work done by the IPPR on how the low-paying sectors in the UK tend to be quite a bit less productive than their counterparts in, say, Germany or France. So I think there's definitely some elements of looking for the positives in this and thinking, how can we use this as much of an advantage as possible. I guess the other point that I wanted to make was kind of on that point around what should people actually be doing, because this is such a kind of unprecedentedly large increase in labour costs, and it comes at the same time as automatic enrolment and the apprenticeship levy, that there's probably a really good role for the BHA to play here in sharing some of the ideas that people are doing. So if there are good ideas out there, if companies are figuring out good ways to adapt, best practice within the sector, I think sharing that as much as possible would be really helpful. But I think the point Ranjit made is spot on about the fact that the lack of consultation on this and the lack of a sense of the government came out and said this is a really big increase in the wage bill for companies, but without, and then kind of just washed their hands and said it's up to you guys to deal with it. I think as much as possible, having more of a sense of an implementation plan, having a sense of, as this wage bill increases, as the wage floor rises higher, what are the things that companies can potentially do? So that kind of best practice, but also looking at things like tax, all the kind of considerations that have already been mentioned around VAT. What are the options there? So there's no magic lever, and there's nothing that you can instantly do, that government can instantly do, or employers can instantly do to improve productivity or to make this all really easy. But I think there's definitely space there for a bit more kind of discussion and a bit more positivity around what might actually be some of the benefits from this, and what are the options available to businesses in responding to this.
Thanks, Conor. So David, it struck me you did mention a couple of times, and you alighted on your presentation, that these forward increases are dependent on a satisfactory economic growth. Now, one would hate to sort of be a predictor of any doom or gloom, but we've heard already of some reductions in or potential reductions in forecasts in terms of economic growth. I mean, how much, it's quite worrying that there was no consultation with your commission. It's quite appalling, actually, I think. But how confident are you that if the economic climate changed, you could really have an impact on some of these measures?
Well, we will be looking in October. It's a process that goes on all year, but this year the decision point for us is October. come October, we'll be getting together as a commission, reviewing all the evidence that we've had, including things like the KPMG survey, and making our recommendations to government. At that time, we'll have, I think, also inputs from the latest economic forecasts. Now, by October, it may not be very clear exactly. It still may not be very clear exactly what the path of the economy is going to be. Well, it never is clear. Economic forecasting is a mug's game. But we will do the best we can. I think it's, as I said, I think it's highly likely that pay now over at least the next year will grow more slowly than it would otherwise have done, based on what everybody says, including most recently you heard from Andrew Sentence, in which case the path towards 60% is going to be lower. So that's the starting point. The question then is, will be for us, if we're heading towards a dramatic economic slowdown, how much weight should we give to that? And I think I can't predict what recommendation will come out with, because I don't know what the circumstances then will be. All I can, as I said, reassure you is that we will do our level best to be as an objective and evidence-driven as we possibly can be.
We'll count on you. I think that's one of the reasons why it's particularly important to get as much data as we can, so that we are very well informed and that we're able to point to the challenges ahead. I mean, there is an interesting question which I'm sure is playing on the minds of a lot of our team members in our businesses, because quite a high proportion of our colleagues have come from the EU, and they'll have concerns. I mean, what's the panel's view? Anybody want to offer up an opinion on how that might impact on the ability to employ people, never mind what rate of pay they're on? Right?
I think at this point in time, until you sort out the question of the single market and whether or not extent to which there's going to be freedom of movement of labour, that issue will need to be, cannot be answered definitively, because the Leave camp is split, as you all know, on that side. But against the background, by definition, if you remove a source of labour in hospitality, which is quite significant, you are going to have, paradoxically, a tightening of the labour market. So you're going to have incomes being driven up inevitably in certain sectors when you have insufficient supply in those areas. Unless, of course, we can do more, unless the great British public and the young can be persuaded to take hospitality as a career, which up to now they've not been really all enamored about doing in terms of working on social hours and those aspects of hospitality work. But inevitably there will be, I think, a movement upwards in incomes and wages as a pressure of Brexit.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think the opportunity that we've got, and it was in the first introduction we had, an inspired young person there that was excited about the industry, that from schools, from colleges and primary school, switching on that ours is a great industry. It isn't long hours, low pay, etc. It's an exciting, vibrant, we can move, we can travel, we can take our skills, we can transfer our skills to other things. But the challenge for us now is looking at recruitment, looking at schools and colleges and training within the industry. I think that there's a labour source, which is a lazy source in one sense, where we've had perception of cheap labour coming across. It's not cheap labour because we pay standard rates of pay. I don't like calling it the minimum wage, I don't like calling it the living wage. It's standard rates of pay. We're obligated to pay those. So if we're going to lose those individuals coming in, we've got to look to our own.
I very much agree with that. I was just, to sort of round off the discussion, would anybody from the audience like to put a question on the national living wage to the to the panel? Go. I've got quite a few here.
Two hands, yeah.
So gentlemen here, have we got a mic? It's coming.
Russell Davidson, can you hear me?
We need some sound.
Russell Davidson from Shoesmith's law firm. We all know that the the living wage was brought in order to end the rather ridiculous situation whereby the government, through tax credits, was subsidising low rates of pay. And of course, George Osborne, as well as not consulting on this measure, did a volte-face on the tax credits. So, what is are there any figures on the cumulative impact of the retention of tax credits and the introduction of the living wage on salary levels generally? Because it seems to me that there's a double hit, there's a hit on industry, and yet there's no tax reduction for the exchequer.
I think one of the really important differentiations there is that often people who are on the minimum wage aren't actually getting tax credits. You can often be very different families. You can have a second earner where someone's, their partner is earning very high wages, so they can be on the minimum wage and it makes a difference to their standard of living, but they're not actually benefiting from tax credits. So I think we shouldn't always see these two things as substitutes, in that you raise minimum wages, that means you can cut tax credits. Oftentimes they're kind of complementary and they work together. So I think rather than looking at it through that lens of it's subsidizing low pay, which I don't think really is borne out by a lot of the evidence on that, I think it's more, but we haven't seen the exact effect that you're kind of looking for in our research.
Yes?
We represent inbound tourism businesses. This is a wider employment question for the panel, if I may. We recently surveyed our members and who told us that a third of their workforce were EU migrants, which is one of the reasons why our members were so pro-Remain. Now that we've got a decision to leave the European Union, what are the panel's thoughts about the impact for employment in the country, not only for our own UK employees, but also for EU migrant employees?
Andrew?
I think along with most of the industry, we all employ a significant proportion of people from the EU. I think in the short term, it's important not to panic. I think that, the message we put out to our employees was typically British, keep calm and carry on, because we don't know how long these negotiations are going to take. If you work for us, whichever country you're from, you're a valued employee and we still want to work with you and develop you, and it may be that any legislation that comes in will only apply to new employees or new people coming into the market. So I think the important thing is not to panic. I think the other thing is, certainly I did a lot of work developing our business in the Middle East, and there's a whole host of really strong hospitality markets which we don't currently tap into. So Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, all those people are born and bred in the hospitality market, Thailand, Philippines. So whichever way the argument goes, I think we, as ever, we'll adapt as an industry. But the important thing is not to do anything knee-jerk, and let's wait and see what we can do within what is within our control, because most of it is outside of our control, apart from the referendum, which we've already done.
One more question, lady.
Bridget Simmons, I run the British Beer and Pub Association. We give evidence to the Low Pay Commission along with the BHA. I suppose the question we all need to ask ourselves in this audience is, what are we going to ask the government to do? Are we going to say that we actually want to ask the Low Pay Commission to go slower in the way that they're increasing it? Are we going to ask for a cut in national insurance, as already been suggested? The panel got other ideas about what we might ask for to help us to cope with this, given the noise that this inevitably is already and is going to be about Brexit.
Thank you. Excellent question. Well, I'm quite happy to give my view on it. I mean, I think we've discussed, first of all, I think it's unacceptable that the fourth largest employer in the UK is not consulted on something that is so fundamental and core to it. I think that's disgraceful. And I think that we should make it clear in our engagement with the government and the opposition that really we will respond, we will be positive, we're a positive industry, but we need to be given forewarning so that we can think about the consequences. I think all of us on this panel, we were discussing it earlier, felt that clearly we've got something which is a major financial burden, and we're all pro giving the best conditions possible for our team members. But I think there are plenty of opportunities for mitigation, and I think that part of the work that's being done by KPMG on behalf of the BHA should be about identifying where we feel, whether it's national insurance, whether it's VAT, whether it's whatever other form, we should be quite vocal about what we want. And I think that's part of really trying to encourage members of all shapes and sizes to push hard to give us the data so that we can be very, very forceful. And I think there is a moment of change, clearly just now, in government, potentially in opposition. Let's not assume that everything's set in stone.
I think if I could just add one thing. We're not alone in this. This is an international movement to raise minimum wages, particularly in the US, where there's a lot of pressure for a $15 minimum wage across the country. And quite a number of areas now, especially on the West Coast, have already implemented a $15 minimum wage. And so we'll be able to see what consequences that has. Because in many ways, the US economy responds like the UK economy, or rather, I should put it the other way around. We respond more like the US. And so and it's not by any means a foregone conclusion, if it leads to widespread job losses, we should be able to see that and learn from the US experience and reflect that in what we recommend.
Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of time. So David, thank you for an excellent presentation. Ranji, Andrew, Connor, Andrew and Simon, thank you very much for your input. Thank you. Yeah.